The bell stood at the center of the colony like a shadow from the past. It was tall, heavy, and dark with age, a piece of metal so old that even the elders said it had been there before the first stone buildings were raised. No one remembered who had built it or why, but everyone knew the same truth. No creature had touched it in living memory. The Alpha's cubs, born fierce and trained to rule, would circle it during their trials but never lay a paw on it. Even at play, when they chased one another with reckless energy, they slowed down near the bell, as if an unseen line of power kept them away. The trainers spoke of the bell in hushed tones. They said it carried a sound that could reach beyond the valley, a sound not of warning but of command. The Alpha's ancestors, they whispered, had once used it to call their packs into unity. When it rang, hundreds of beasts would roar in answer, their voices rising like a storm. But that time was gone. The bell had become silent, and no cub since had dared to wake it. Recruits from many worlds came to train beside the Alpha's cubs. They were tested in strength, speed, and courage. For them, the bell was little more than a strange relic, something the trainers always mentioned but never explained fully. Some laughed at the idea of a piece of old metal carrying power. Others, seeing the cubs' fear of it, grew uneasy. It was one thing for humans to doubt old legends, but when the strongest predators of the colony avoided it, the doubt turned into a quiet respect. Among the recruits was one who paid more attention to the silence around the bell than to the stories. While the others mocked or ignored it, this human watched the way the cubs reacted. The cubs were not mindless animals. They were intelligent, proud, and bold. Yet every time they neared the bell, they pulled back. Their claws clicked against the stone, their ears pressed low, their tails stiff with unease. Something deeper than instinct kept them away. The human felt the weight of that silence. It wasn't just emptiness. It was heavy, almost alive. When the wind blew across the valley, it carried a faint hum around the bell's frame, like a voice trying to wake but failing. At night, when the camp was quiet, the human sometimes walked close enough to see its surface glimmer under the moons. Strange markings, faded but still visible, covered its body. Not random scratches, but lines that curved and met in patterns. They almost looked like words, though no one alive could read them. The trainers warned the recruits to keep their distance. "It is not for you," they said. "It is not for any of us. The bell belongs to the Alpha's line." The words were final, but the human couldn't forget the sound of them. If it truly belonged to the Alpha's line, why did the cubs refuse it? Why had it stayed silent for so long? Training days were long and exhausting. The human was not the strongest recruit. Many times arms trembled from carrying heavy weights, and legs nearly gave out from running endless courses. Others laughed, calling the human too fragile, too slow, someone who would never last. Yet even while struggling, the human kept glancing at the bell. Its presence was a reminder that there were mysteries here, greater than muscles or speed. The cubs trained hard as well. They were growing into hunters, learning to leap, fight, and command with natural power. When they roared, the ground seemed to shake. Still, not once did their eyes drift toward the bell with anything but fear. Sometimes, during a break, the cubs would lie in the shade, their breathing heavy, their eyes glowing in the half-light. The human noticed how they always chose spots far from the bell, as if its very shadow unsettled them. One evening, when the sky was painted in orange and violet, the human sat alone at the edge of the training yard. The cubs had been returned to their den, and the recruits were scattered in their tents. The bell stood silent as always. For the first time, the human let the thought rise. What if I touched it? The idea was both frightening and thrilling. The trainers had said not to. The cubs refused to. But what if all of them were wrong? What if the silence of the bell was not a warning, but an invitation? The human pushed the thought away that night. But it returned again the next morning, stronger than before. Days passed. The human grew more aware of the small details, how the wind changed near the bell, how the cubs' roars grew quiet when they trained too close, how even the trainers avoided looking at it directly. The human began to feel that the bell was waiting, not abandoned, not forgotten, but waiting for the right touch. During one training trial, the cubs were released to chase moving targets across the yard. Their power was wild, claws tearing the dirt, teeth snapping at the air. The recruits cheered and shouted, but in the chaos, one of the targets bounced too close to the bell. A cub sprinted after it, but at the last second, skidded to a halt, ears flat against its head. The target slammed against the bell's base with a dull thud, and the cub fled backward, whimpering softly. The yard went silent. Trainers stood frozen. Recruits stared wide-eyed, and the human felt a strange heat in the chest. The bell had not rung, but that single moment proved it wasn't just a piece of metal. It held power, enough to frighten even the bravest cub. That night, the human couldn't sleep. The image of the cub halting before the bell replayed over and over. The sound of the target striking it, though dull, had echoed strangely in the air. It wasn't the sharp sound of wood on metal. It was deeper, like the first breath before a storm. The human rose quietly and walked through the silent camp. The moons hung high, washing the valley in silver light. The bell stood alone, its surface glowing faintly. For the first time, the human approached it without hesitation. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself wanted to pull back. The closer the human got, the stronger the hum in the air grew, a sound that wasn't heard but felt in the bones. Stopping a few feet away, the human stared up at it. The carvings seemed clearer now, the curves and lines weaving together like a map. A hand lifted slowly, trembling slightly. The urge to touch it was overwhelming, stronger than fear, stronger than doubt, but the hand stopped just short of the surface. Not yet, not tonight. The human lowered the hand and stepped back, heart pounding. The bell remained silent, but its presence had grown louder than ever. The human knew one truth now. The silence of the bell was not emptiness. It was waiting, and though no one else believed it, the human felt certain, someday soon, that silence would end. The days after the training trial passed slowly, yet the human could not shake the image of the cub stopping in fear near the bell. That single moment replayed over and over, as though it carried a meaning that no one else seemed to see. The trainers treated it like nothing had happened. The recruits laughed about the cub's hesitation, joking that even the fiercest beasts had limits. But the human stayed quiet. Deep down, something about the bell gnawed at the mind, pulling attention away from drills, away from exercises, and toward its silent, looming presence. The bell was more than metal. That much was clear. Its surface, dark with age, seemed to hold a hidden energy, a weight that went beyond what the eye could see. The human noticed things others ignored. During the hot afternoons, when sunlight struck its body, the air around it shimmered faintly as if heated. At night, when the moons cast their silver glow, the markings on its frame appeared brighter, like soft veins of light running through stone. Others passed by without a second glance. To them, it was an old relic, a piece of history not worth their time. But to the human, every detail mattered. Every hum in the air, every shift in the cub's behavior near it, every whisper of old stories told by the trainers, it all formed a puzzle that begged to be solved. The curiosity grew stronger. With each day, the human began asking quiet questions. The first were simple. How long had the bell stood there? Who had made it? Why did no one touch it? The trainers gave short answers, often avoiding eye contact. It's older than the colony, one muttered. Built by hands long gone, said another. Some refused to answer at all, brushing off the questions with sharp tones. "Don't waste thought on it. Focus on your training." But their discomfort only fueled the humans' interest. Why avoid speaking of it? Why warn recruits to keep their distance if it was truly nothing more than metal? One evening, while the camp was quiet, the human visited the records tent. It was filled with digital screens and dusty books brought from old worlds. Most recruits used it to study battle strategies or survival guides. But the humans searched for anything, any hint that might mention the bell. The archives were scattered, fragments of reports and notes written by travelers, trainers, and elders long dead. Hours passed, eyes scanning words that seemed to lead nowhere. Yet small pieces began to form a pattern. There were references to a call that stirs the wild, notes about beasts gathering at the sound of thunder not born of storms, mentions of a circle of unity where cubs once roared in unison. None of the texts named the bell directly, but the descriptions were too close to ignore. The human leaned back, heartbeat quickening. Could it be that this bell, standing in silence now, had once carried a voice powerful enough to move entire packs of beasts? The thought was thrilling, but it also raised more questions. Why had it gone silent? Why did the cubs, who were born with fierceness in their blood, fear it so deeply? Was it because they no longer understood its meaning? Or because they remembered something that the humans had forgotten? The next day, during training, while others ran drills, the humans stole glances at the cubs. Their movements were swift and sharp, their roars full of energy. Yet each time they neared the bell, their pace slowed, their eyes darting nervously. The humans' curiosity sharpened. If the cubs could sense danger, perhaps they were sensing something humans could not. That night, lying in the quiet of the tent, the human thought long and hard. Curiosity was no longer a simple interest. It had become a calling, a pull so strong it felt almost alive. The bell was not just waiting, it was asking to be understood. Over the following weeks, the humans' focus shifted. Training still continued. Hours of drills, weightlifting, and endurance runs. But the bell remained at the center of thought. The human began to study it in secret. Each evening, when the cubs were returned to their dens and the recruits drifted to sleep, footsteps would lead to the edge of the yard where the bell stood tall. Sometimes the human sat on a stone nearby, staring up at it in silence. Other times, fingertips traced the air a few inches from its surface, never daring to touch but close enough to feel a strange chill. It was not the cold of metal. It was something deeper, a vibration that ran through the skin and into the bones. One night, as the wind blew softly across the valley, the human leaned closer than ever before. The carvings on the bell seemed alive, their lines weaving together like rivers of forgotten meaning. Fingers hovered above them, the urge to trace the symbols almost unbearable. For a moment, the human imagined what sound it would make if struck. Would it be sharp and metallic, or deep and earth-shaking, like thunder rolling across mountains? The thought alone sent a shiver down the spine. The human's curiosity soon began to affect daily life. During meals, while others laughed and shared stories, the human sat quietly, lost in thought. During drills, when instructors barked commands, the human obeyed, but with half the attention, eyes always drifting toward the shadow of the bell. The other recruits noticed. Some mocked, whispering that the human was obsessed with a useless relic. Others shrugged it off, thinking it was just a distraction from weakness in training, but the cubs noticed too. During rest periods, when they lay stretched on the ground, their golden eyes often followed the human's movements. At first, it felt unsettling. Then it felt as though they were watching for a reason. Could they sense the pull as well? One evening, a storm rolled over the valley. Dark clouds covered the moons, and lightning split the sky. Rain hammered against the ground, soaking the camp in minutes. Most recruits hurried into shelters, but the human remained outside, drawn once again toward the bell. It stood under the storm. Water running down its surface, the carvings gleaming in flashes of lightning. The human stood in front of it, chest rising and falling with the storm's rhythm. Thunder roared above, and in that sound, the human imagined hearing the echo of a bell's voice, low, powerful, unending. The storm passed, leaving the camp drenched and quiet. The human walked back soaked to the bone but more certain than ever. The bell was not silent. It was waiting for someone to dare. From that night onward, the curiosity was no longer just curiosity, it was resolve. The human began to prepare, not in secret, not with words, but with the quiet strength of someone who knows a test is coming. The trainers had said the bell was not for them. The cubs had shown only fear, but the human's heart whispered a different truth. Perhaps it did not belong to bloodlines or beasts. Perhaps it belonged to courage itself, and if that was true, then one day when the moment came, the human would not hold back. The bell would ring again. The day of the trial arrived without warning. The recruits were woken early, the morning air still cold and heavy with mist. Instructors gave no details, only a command to gather at the training ground. Their voices carried an edge that hinted this test would be different from the others. Some recruits whispered nervously as they lined up. The cubs were brought out as well, their golden eyes sharp and restless. The bell loomed in the center of the yard, silent as always. But today its presence felt heavier, as if it knew something was about to happen. The human stood among the line of recruits, heart steady but mind alive with questions. Weeks of quiet, study, nights of sitting near the bell, and the storm that had shaken the valley had all built toward this moment. Still, there was no clear plan, only an unshakable pull toward the silent bell. The trial began. The recruits were ordered to face a series of challenges that combined strength, courage, and instinct. The cubs would be part of it, circling them, testing their reactions. The human's turn came later, but even while watching others struggle, eyes kept drifting toward the bell. Its markings caught the morning light, faintly glowing like embers under ash. The cubs, too, moved uneasily whenever they drew close to it, as though the weight of the past pressed on them more heavily today than ever. When the human's name was called, silence fell. The cubs were released. They moved like shadows, circling with low growls, their steps deliberate and powerful. Their presence was meant to intimidate, to break focus. The other recruits who had gone before had faced them with weapons or bravado, trying to hold their ground. Some succeeded, others failed, but the human did not raise a weapon. Instead, each step was slow, calm, directed toward the bell. The instructors barked orders, demanding the recruits stay within the circle of the trial, but the human's feet carried forward as though pulled by something stronger than command. The cubs noticed immediately. Their growls deepened, their bodies lowering, tails flicking in warning. Yet they did not attack. They mirrored the unease they always showed near the bell. The human walked straight toward it, eyes fixed on the ancient metal. The crowd behind the barrier grew restless. Recruits whispered in disbelief. Trainers frowned, exchanging sharp glances. No one had ever dared break from the trial to approach the bell. Finally, the human reached it. Standing beneath its shadow, the body trembled. Not from fear of the cubs, but from the weight of the choice. To touch it was to defy the trainers, to step beyond what had been forbidden. To ring it was to cross a line no one had crossed in generations. The cubs closed in now, circling tightly. Their growls rose in pitch, a chorus of warning. But still, they did not strike. Their eyes, glowing and sharp, flicked between the human and the bell. It was as if they were waiting too, sensing what was about to happen. The human raised a hand. Fingers brushed the cold, rough surface of the bell. A shock ran up the arm, not painful but powerful, like touching the edge of a storm. The crowd gasped. Even the trainers froze. The human's breath caught in the throat, but the hand stayed firm. Then, with a deep inhale, the human drew back and struck the bell with the flat of the palm. The sound that followed was nothing like anyone expected. It was not a sharp clang or a hollow ring. It was deep, rolling like thunder pulled from the belly of the earth. The ground itself seemed to vibrate, dust rising in small clouds. The sound spread outward, echoing across the valley, carrying on the wind like a voice calling out to the world. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The cubs froze mid-step, ears pricked, eyes wide. The trainers stood silent, their authority stripped by the roar of the bell. The recruits clutched at their chests, stunned by the weight of the sound. Even the human, hand still pressed to the bell, felt the vibration surge through every bone, filling the body with energy both terrifying and exhilarating. Then it happened. The cubs, who had once trembled in fear near the bell, lifted their heads high. Their growls turned into roars, loud and fierce, answering the call. One after another, their voices joined, until the yard was filled with a storm of sound. Their roars rolled over the hills, blending with the echo of the bell, a harmony of beast and metal that shook the sky. The crowd was in shock. Never before had the cubs done this. They had been trained for obedience, for aggression, for silence. But never had they roared in unison like this. Their voices were not of anger, but of recognition, of loyalty. It was as if the bell had awoken, something buried deep within them, something only the human had been able to stir. The trainers shouted for order, but their voices were drowned by the thunder of the roars. Some recruits stared in awe, others in fear. No one could deny what they were seeing. The cubs were answering the human, not the trainers, not the alpha's bloodline, but the one who had dared to strike the bell. The human stood firm, body trembling, heart racing. The roars surrounded them, powerful yet strangely protective. It felt less like being threatened and more like being acknowledged, as if the cubs were saying, "You are one of us. You are heard." When the roars finally faded, silence returned to the yard heavier than before. Dust settled. The bell stood still, its surface humming faintly as if satisfied. The cubs lowered themselves to the ground around the human, not in submission, but in solidarity. They had chosen. The trainers rushed forward, faces pale and eyes wide with disbelief. They tried to explain it away, to tell the recruits it was nothing but instinct, a coincidence. But no one believed them. Everyone had seen the truth with their own eyes. The human stepped back from the bell, chest rising, and falling with deep breaths. The cubs stayed close, their eyes still fixed on the figure who had dared what none of them could. In that moment, the human knew there was no turning back. The choice had been made, the silence broken, the bond sealed. This was not just defiance. It was the beginning of something greater, something that could not be undone. The human had crossed the line, and in doing so, had awakened not only the voice of the bell, but the voices of the cubs themselves, and the world would never be the same again. The air was still shaking from the echo of the bell. For a long moment, no one moved. The sound lingered, rolling off the mountains, drifting across the valley like an ancient memory returned to life. Dust hung in the air, glowing in the morning. Light. And then the cubs roared again. It was not a single roar, but many, each one deep and fierce, blending together into a sound so powerful it seemed to bend the earth. They stood in a circle around the human, their golden eyes blazing, their voices rising as though they were answering a call that had been waiting for centuries. Their roars were not of rage, not of fear, but of recognition. It was as if the bell had spoken to them in a language only they could hear, and the human had become the bridge. The recruits who stood watching were frozen in place. Some covered their ears, unable to handle the sheer force of the sound, while others stared wide-eyed, their faces pale with awe. None of them had ever seen the cubs act this way. The cubs were meant to be controlled, silent until commanded, weapons in training. But here they were, roaring on their own and not for their trainers, roaring for the human who had dared to touch the forbidden bell. The instructors were furious. Their shouts were lost in the storm of sound. They barked commands at the cubs, ordering them back, demanding silence. But the cubs ignored them completely. They did not even look in the instructor's direction. Their eyes, their bodies, their voices, all were fixed on the human standing at the center. The human stood still, hands at the sides, chest rising and falling with each breath. The vibration of the bell still lingered in the bones, running through, the veins like fire. Each roar from the cubs seemed to echo inside the human, not as a threat, but as a strange kind of welcome. It was terrifying and breathtaking at the same time. The ground beneath their feet trembled with the combined power of the bell and the cubs. The recruits felt it in their knees, in their chests, in the pit of their stomachs. This was not training anymore. This was something bigger, something older. The cubs were no longer acting like trained beasts. They were acting like a pack, a family, and they had chosen the human as their center. One of the cubs stepped closer. Its body was massive, its paws heavy as they struck the earth, but its movement carried no threat. It stopped right in front of the human, lowered its head, and let out one last roar, this time directed straight upward to the sky. The sound tore through the clouds like lightning. The other cubs followed, raising their voices until the valley shook again. And then, as suddenly as it had started, silence fell. The cubs lowered their heads, breathing heavily, their bodies relaxed. The sound of their roars still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, but their voices had gone quiet. All eyes were on the human. The cubs moved closer, pressing into a loose circle around the figure at the bell. Their bodies blocked the path of anyone who might try to step in. The instructors tried to step forward, but the cubs growled, low and warning. It was not a threat of attack, it was protection. The meaning was clear. The human was theirs. The recruits began to whisper, voices rising with a mix of fear and wonder. "Did you see that?" They answered the bell. No, they answered them. None of them could deny what they had seen. The cubs had ignored their trainers and roared in response to the human. It was not just defiance, it was allegiance. The instructors had no words. For years, they had used fear to keep control. They had trained the cubs to obey without question. Yet in a single moment, the cubs had broken every rule, and worse, the recruits had witnessed it all. Authority had cracked. The human slowly stepped away from the bell, body trembling from the weight of what had happened. Each step was careful, not out of fear, but out of the awareness that everything had changed. The cubs followed, their massive forms moving with unshakable loyalty. Wherever the human went, they moved too, shadows bound by choice, not by training. For the rest of the day, the camp was filled with whispers. Recruits gathered in small groups, replaying the moment in their minds. Some were frightened, others excited, but all of them knew they had seen something historic. The instructors tried to downplay it, calling it a mistake, a trick of instinct, but no one believed them. The image of the cubs roaring in answer to the bell was burned into their minds. That night, as the fires burned low and the camp quieted, the cubs gathered around the human's tent. They lay close, their eyes glowing softly in the dark, their bodies warm and solid like guardians. Every rustle in the grass, every shift in the shadows was met with a low growl from their throats. They were no longer beasts on command. They had chosen who they would follow. The human lay awake inside, staring at the canvas roof of the tent, heart heavy with questions. Why had the cubs chosen to roar? Why now, after years of silence? Why respond to a single strike of the bell? when no one else had dared to touch it. But deeper than the questions was a quiet truth. Something had passed between them that day, something unspoken but undeniable. The human was no longer just the weakest recruit, the one overlooked and underestimated. The cubs had made their choice, and their choice had changed everything. The next morning, when training resumed, the cubs refused to move unless the human was present. They ignored commands from the instructors, standing still as statues. But the moment the human arrived, they lifted their heads, eyes bright, ready to follow. The instructors raged, shouting louder, cracking whips, trying to re-establish control, but the cubs remained unmoved. Their loyalty was no longer bought with commands or punishments. The recruits watched in stunned silence. For them, this was no longer about training drills or survival lessons. This was about power, power that had shifted in front of their eyes. The human had not asked for it, had not sought it, but had become the center of something far greater than training. The cub's roar had done more than shake the valley. It had shaken the balance of everything within the camp. The bell was no longer silent, the cubs were no longer obedient, and the human was no longer invisible. The roar was not just a sound. It was a declaration, and everyone knew it was only the beginning. The morning air was cool, the kind that carried a quiet stillness before the noise of the day began. The camp was awake, but it did not feel the same as it once had. Something had shifted, something invisible yet heavy. The sound of the bell still lived in everyone's memory, and the roars of the cubs still echoed in their bones. Nothing could erase what they had witnessed. The humans stepped out from the tent, blinking against the pale light. The cubs were waiting, all of them lying in a half-circle around the entrance, as though they had spent the entire night on guard. Their eyes followed every move, not with suspicion, but with certainty, as if they already knew where their leader would go and what they would do. When the human began to walk, the cubs rose together, powerful bodies moving in unison, forming a living shield on either side. Whispers ran through the recruits scattered across the training grounds. No one laughed anymore. No one muttered about weakness or failure. Instead, they watched with a mixture of awe and unease. The sight was too real, too undeniable. The cubs had chosen. It was no accident, no trick. They had shown loyalty and, in doing so, they had rewritten what strength meant. The instructors stood in silence, their usual control slipping further away with every step the human took. They had tried to demand obedience, to reassert the old order, but the cubs had rejected them. Commands had become meaningless. The authority of the trainers cracked under the weight of the roars, and there was no way to piece it back together. The human walked steadily, feeling the eyes of everyone in the camp. Each step was heavier than the last, not because of fear, but because of the responsibility pressing down. The cubs' loyalty was not a gift to be taken lightly. It was a bond forged in something deeper than strength or dominance. It was trust, a trust earned in ways no one could have predicted. When training began, the instructors attempted to continue as before. They ordered the recruits into lines, barked instructions, and prepared the drills. But the cubs would not move. They stood still, tails flicking, heads high, refusing every word that was not spoken by the human. Silence spread across the grounds as everyone realized what was happening. The instructor's words meant nothing, but a single glance, a small gesture from the human was enough to make the cubs obey. At first, the human hesitated, unsure of what to do. Giving commands had never been part of the role, yet the cubs were waiting. They were not forced into this. They wanted it. So the human spoke softly, a simple word, and the cubs obeyed instantly, moving into formation. The air filled with gasps from the recruits. What they had witnessed was more than obedience. It was devotion. Day after day, the same pattern repeated. The instructors grew restless, their frustration visible. but their power had slipped too far from their grasp. The recruits, once divided between mockery and silence, now leaned closer, eager to learn from the one they had overlooked. They no longer saw weakness when they looked at the human. They saw the figure who had touched the bell, who had stood in the storm of roars, who had been chosen by the cubs. Nights in the camp changed too. Where once the cubs were kept at a distance, chained and controlled, they now gathered freely around the human. Their breaths rumbled softly in the dark. Their presence a living wall of protection. The recruits whispered to one another that the human was no longer just another trainee, but something more, something the cubs themselves had created. One evening, under the silver glow of the moons, the human sat by the fire while the cubs lay, close, their fur shining like molten metal in the light. Thoughts swirled in silence. The bell, the roars, the eyes of the cubs. It was all so much larger than any one person. And yet the truth had become clear. Strength was not about who could strike hardest or stand tallest. Strength was about spirit, about the courage to do what no one else dared, about the bond that could not be broken by fear. That bond was now unshakable. The human had not sought it, but it had been forged all the same. The cubs were not just beasts anymore. They were family, allies, voices that had chosen to roar for someone who had been called weak. The instructors tried one last time to break the bond. They staged a test, a harsh one, setting obstacles in the path of both the human and the cubs. They believed the cubs would falter, that the bond would prove fragile under pressure. But the opposite happened. At every challenge, the cubs stood firm. At every danger, they moved as one. And at the center, the human did not falter either. Together, they overcame everything laid before them. By the end of the trial, there was no denying the truth. Even the instructors, red-faced with anger, could not erase what all had seen. The human had not just earned the loyalty of the cubs, they had earned respect from the entire camp. The weakest recruit had redefined what leadership meant. Word of the bell and the roars spread beyond the camp. Stories traveled fast, carried by recruits returning home, by whispers between travelers, by messages sent across colonies. People, who had never set foot in the valley, began to speak of the human who rang the ancient bell and the cubs who answered. It became more than a story. It became a symbol. For some, it was a reminder that strength was not limited to the powerful. For others, it was proof that humanity had a place even among creatures bred for dominance. For the cubs themselves, it was the beginning of something new. No longer did they see themselves as tools, but as partners. The humans stood at the center of all of this, carrying the weight of the bond with quiet steadiness. There was no need for grand speeches or claims of power. The truth was written in every roar, in every step the cubs took alongside. As the moon set and another day began, the human walked through the valley once more. The cubs followed, their heads high, their roars silent, but present in every heartbeat. Recruits stepped aside, not out of fear, but out of respect. Even the instructors did not interfere anymore. Strength had been redefined. It was no longer measured in muscle or rank. It was measured in spirit, in courage, in the bond between human and beast. The bell had been silent for generations, but with one strike, it had spoken again, and its voice had changed everything. The human had not just gained the loyalty of the cubs. Together they had created a new future, one where strength came not from fear, but from unity. And the roars that had once shaken the valley would live on, echoing forever in the memory of all who had heard them. The bond was forged, and it could never be broken.